God stopped Abraham from sacrificing his one and only son, whom he loved very much. But God did not stop himself from sacrificing his one and only son, whom he loves very much. From the beginning of creation, God preordained himself to be that sacrifice. He knows we're good people, but we just don't have anything good enough to offer him to make up for that sin. God himself provided that for us. Our good God stepped up to the plate for us. And he wants us to know that, and he wants us to know what he endured as a father. He does have feelings and emotions. I'm well pleased in my son. I'm upset with creation. I'm going to destroy it with a flood. I'm upset with my people worshiping a golden calf. God reveals he does have emotions. And he wants us to know at this time in our history what he endured. So let us now see exactly what God did endure and what his son Jesus did go through in his passion. Okay, we're going to look at what the shroud has to reveal about the passion of Jesus and the holy instruments that were used in the passion of Jesus. Looking at the shroud stays within the context of prophecy or scripture. Isaiah, in his prophecy of the Messiah, tells us that not a sound spot will be left on this body, and there isn't. From head to foot, there's over 120 scourge marks on the back of Jesus. This is the front of Jesus. This is the front image of Jesus. The other panel is the rear or dorsal image of Jesus. And they arrested Jesus, and they brought Jesus to Caiaphas. Now, while Jesus was with Caiaphas, the soldiers abused Jesus. They kicked Jesus, they spit on Jesus, and they punched Jesus. And if we look at the prophecy of Isaiah again, he gave his cheeks to the strikers and his beard to the pluckers. Revealed in the shroud is we see this dark image on the chin of Jesus. In all likelihood, they grabbed Jesus by his beard and yanked him down to the ground, and pulling out a clump of hair right out of his chin, a clump of beard. And we see the fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy. He gave his chin to the pluckers, and they pulled a piece of Jesus' beard right out of his chin. Jesus was put in a dungeon overnight. It was cold. He shivered. We know it was cold. The Gospels tell us that Peter followed and sat in the outer courtyard around a fire to keep warm. So we know it was cold. So they put Jesus in the dungeon overnight, body on the verge of shock from the agony in the garden, that much of loss of sweat and blood, not eating, not sleeping, again on the verge of shock, cold, shivering all night. And the next morning, they take Jesus to Pilate. Now, Pilate did not want to have Jesus crucified. Pilate thought he would appease the people and have Jesus scourged. Now, if you saw the movie The Passion, what they used in that movie was a cat o' nine tails. That's not what was used according to the shroud, although it does do the same damage. This is what was used. This is an authentic replica of a first century Roman flagrum. We know this is what was used according to the shroud. What a flagrum means short-handled whip. It has 2 or 3 leather thongs of different lengths, and either tipped with the ankle bones of sheep or dumbbell-shaped lead balls, just as we see here, with little spikes or protrusions sticking out. That was meant to embed itself into the individual's flesh and rip it out. These dumbbell-shaped lead balls, according to the shroud, match perfectly with the scourge marks. So we know that this was the instrument that was used. The Romans were experts. They knew the damage they were going to do. They knew how to do it. Each leather thong was a different length for a very good reason. Because if these were the same lengths, they might take a chance on one overlapping the other end and not doing damage to a different part of the body. So the flagrum was made, the thongs in different lengths, so that with each strike, damage was done to a different part of the body. Jesus was scourged in the nude, according to the shroud, in front of his mother and in front of his friends. The embarrassment that Jesus endured, looking at his mom crying, and him trying to keep her strong and enduring his own scourging. And you were bent over and tied to a whipping post. And there was a reason for that. When they tie you over, your skin stretches. The flagrum opens the skin. And when they're done with you, they stand you up, and those wounds close and cause excruciating pain. Then they took Jesus. Now, Matthew's account tells us Jesus was abused by the whole praetorium, or by the whole cohort in the praetorium. Now, a cohort in the first century was between 500 and 600 men. So it's a lot of people shoving Jesus around, kicking Jesus, and spitting on Jesus and abusing Jesus. After they abused Jesus, they sat Jesus on a stump and put a robe around him. And according to the burial shroud, this is what was used to be placed on his head, the crown of thorns. Looking at the dorsal image of Jesus, there are between 50 and 75 puncture wounds around the whole scalp of Jesus. It's not a ringlet like we're used to seeing depicted in art. It is a whole cap of thorns. This was from a plant readily available in the environs of Jerusalem. The Gospels tell us they wove a crown of thorns, so it was something that was available right there. And they placed it on the head of Jesus. And then they put the cross to Jesus, and Jesus carried his cross. And Jesus carried just his cross piece, which would have weighed approximately 110 to 120 pounds. Not a full cross, as we're typically used to thinking Jesus carried, which weighed about 300 pounds. A healthy man would not have been able to drag a full cross for the distance that Jesus did from the praetorium to Golgotha. Looking at the dorsal image of the shroud, or the back of Jesus, we notice the wounds over the right shoulder are smeared and under the left scapula, indicative of Jesus carrying his cross piece diagonal across his back. High to the right, low to the left, which would be indicative of Jesus being right-handed also. The way Jesus carried his cross piece Okay, Father, if you don't mind helping me, just tie that loop around my left ankle and then tighten it up. Okay, thank you. This is precisely how Jesus carried his cross piece as revealed in his holy shroud. The left side was tied to the left ankle. The right side was tied to the individual in front of you, and you were tied to your cross piece. The reason for this is because this was actually your first set of handcuffs. They had to keep you confined. If you were on your way to be crucified and you saw an alley, you would be tempted to drop your cross piece and take off down an alley. You being tied to it prevented you from doing that. The left side, again, was tied to your left ankle, right side to the individual in front, and the reason for that is so that you couldn't use your cross piece as a weapon. You couldn't whack the guards with it. Okay? They kept you totally confined. But this is what caused Jesus to fall. On the way to Golgotha, the other two victims were being whipped on the way to Golgotha. And when you are whipped, you jerk. Jesus, being the last in line, when they were whipped, they jerked. And this jerked Jesus' cross piece. Up went Jesus' left leg, and down Jesus went, mostly on his left knee. Okay, Father, if you could just please take this back off. Under close examination of the shroud, we see Jesus fell mostly on his left knee. Tradition tells us that Jesus fell 3 times. We don't get that from the Gospels. but that's fine. Jesus would go down, slam his left knee on the ground, and then smack his face on the pavement. Traces of limestone were found on different areas of the face, indicative of Jesus falling many times. But we'll go with the 3 times. But Jesus would fall. Down Jesus would go, smack his face on the pavement. The only thing that saved Jesus' skull from being crushed by his crosspiece is because when he went down and his face went down, the crosspiece came down, but because it was tied to the individual in front, the rope got taut and stopped the crosspiece just short of crushing Jesus' skull. After Jesus carried his cross, they placed the crosspiece down in front of the upright, and they nailed Jesus to his crosspiece. Now, according to the burial shroud, they placed the nail in the wrist of Jesus. And these are what were used. These are first century Roman roofing nails. Roofing nails in the first century were not even cut. They were different lengths, handmade. You would have a lot of these in a pail, and they would take them out and use the shorter ones for the wrist and the longer ones for the feet. But the nails were introduced in the wrist, affixing Jesus to his crosspiece. This is a typical Roman tau cross. This is what was used in first century Roman crucifixions. When they affixed you to your crosspiece, they simply lifted this up, and because of the pain, you stood up with it. And they would place you on the upright and drive a spike through your feet. After a while, Jesus expired on his cross. Jesus died. And one of the soldiers took this, a first century Roman thrusting spear, and introduced this right between the 5th and 6th rib of Jesus, inserting it, severing his heart, and almost coming out his back.
Any illustrations I saw of the crucifixion were of a fairly placid Jesus looking down in pity from the cross. This was not a pretty picture.
Dr. Carl McCurdy has studied Jesus' crucifixion and has filled in many scientific details that the Bible leaves out.
Jesus allowed himself to suffer, and I couldn't imagine a worse way to die.
Jesus said, "This is your hour, when darkness reigns." Luke 22:52 and 53.
Thursday night, April 6th, 30 AD. Most historians agree this is the date of Jesus' arrest.
Pilate had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. Mark 15:15.
For prisoners sentenced to crucifixion, the first step was flogging. The Romans used a whip called a flagrum. It was specially designed to rip the skin off a prisoner's back.
They had it down to an art. The iron would make bruises, but then these pieces of bone would begin to cut into the skin and the subcutaneous tissue, and actually would result in lacerations all the way down to the muscle. The pain would be intense and unrelenting. The point of the scourging was to bring the victim as close to exhaustion and as close to death as possible before actually taking him to the cross.
The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on his head. Then they struck him on the head again and again. Matthew 27:29 and 30.
Next, for Jesus, a special punishment. The thorns themselves were most likely several inches long and horribly painful.
The face and the scalp have probably the best blood supply of any areas of skin on the body. You also have some of the most nerves, some of the greatest number of nerves in the skin would be on the scalp and the face. Again, intense, sharp pain.
They seized Simon of Cyrene, put the cross on him, and made him carry it. Luke 23:26.
It weighed between 80 and 110 pounds, and knowing that Jesus could not carry what the Romans call the patibulum gives clues about the beating he'd already suffered.
One thing that we see in trauma is that a young person, a person who is in good condition, may be much closer to death than we think from the blood loss. So even though Jesus at this point was stumbling and could remain upright, he was probably very near the edge of total circulatory collapse.
He went out to the place of the skull, and here they crucified him. John 19:17.
Crucifixion was a relatively bloodless process. The nails Romans used resembled railroad spikes. There was one pounded through both feet and one hammered through each wrist.
A nail or spike through the palm would never hold the weight of a body, but the spike inserted through here would get right in the middle of those wrist bones and would enable the body to be suspended by the strength of those ligaments. The pain would be like hot liquid. It would be a hot shooting pain back up the arm. It would leave the hand in a claw shape and paralyzed.
Death on a cross had little to do with nails. Instead, crucifixion normally meant death by suffocation.
The only way you can adequately breathe would be to push up with the impaled feet, pull up with the arms in order to breathe, and then sag down again in exhaustion. And obviously, every time that happened, there was intense pain in the arms. The scourged back would rub against the rough wood of the cross. The impaled feet would also have their own nerve pain and pain shooting up the legs. And it would be pure agony to simply take a breath.
With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. Mark 15:37.
Crucifixion often took days, but Jesus died quickly, and as the loud cry suggests, he also died suddenly.
A catastrophic terminal event is a pathologist's phrase to mean that something happened all of a sudden to cause death. And my feeling would be that his scourging was so intense, that the blood loss that preceded the crucifixion was so intense that shortened the length of time of the crucifixion. And in this case, the final event was I'm sure either an abnormal heart rhythm or his heart simply stopped.
Yeah, I believe that Christ's suffering and the demonstration of the kind of physiologic stress that his human body was under is manifested in the Garden of Gethsemane, where it's described that he was sweating blood. And there is a well-documented medical condition in which patients who are under tremendous amount of emotional stress and physiological stress can in fact sweat blood, because little blood vessels within the glands burst and then the blood is expressed. The scourge involved the use of a short whip with pieces of typically metal, sometimes bone, sometimes pieces of porcelain wrapped in these leather straps, which is then utilized to come across typically the back, the shoulders, the legs of the victim. And the first few passes across a particular body part would tear through the skin, the fat, but eventually, once the outer layers were torn away, it would start getting in the muscle and the tendon. And of course, along the way, you're ripping through all the blood vessels that supply all those tissues. And so you're losing blood the whole time. The plant that was described actually had a very long thorn, not the little thorns that we would think from a rose bush. These were thorns that were typically 1.5 to 2 inches in length. The scalp is one of the most vascular portions of our bodies. It had a huge blood supply up there. So then having those thorns shoved down into the, down onto the bony plate would have gone through all the scalp, which in and of itself would have created a huge amount of blood loss. I've seen people actually bleed to death from just a scalp injury. So it's not a small injury to have, who knows, dozens of these things shoved into your scalp. And so that would have caused more blood loss. Typically, when a victim has to carry the cross, what has been described in the literature, in actual Roman literature, is they describe they carry the crossbar, and the crossbar is estimated alone was estimated to weigh about 110 pounds. And of course, if your arms are stuck out here, wrapped up on the crossbar, and you fall down, you need help getting up. You just can't get up on your own because there's no possible way without your arms to get up. So he would have needed help getting up. If he fell over, there's a good chance that he could have hit his chest, which then could account for the possibility of a cardiac injury. Anatomically, we consider the wrists as part of the hand, and so with the placement of the nails between the radius and the ulna, at that position, it still fits the definition of being in the hand, and it's in a position in which the nail won't rip out, which you have to have a solid point of fixation. Another interesting point about the placement of that is the median nerve goes right straight through that particular portion of the wrist, and so there would have been either destruction of the nerve or impingement of the nerve that would have created a tremendous amount of pain, so that every time you try to take a breath, it'd be agonizing. You'd be pushing down on spiked feet, which of course hurt, and then you'd be hanging on spiked arms. And so you alternate from excruciating pain to excruciating pain every time you take a breath. So even if he survives the actual crucifixion, he would have had to survive what I believe to be a lethal injury from the spear to find out whether he was alive or not. What's described is the loss of water and blood, and that would entail either a pleural effusion or pericardial effusion, and the blood would have come from either pulmonary artery, a pulmonary vein, the aorta or vena cava, or the heart itself. None of those injuries, unless you're treated immediately by a trauma surgeon like myself, with all the advanced equipment that we have, would be survivable after even a few minutes. Christ, as the Son of God, could have survived anything. He chose to manifest himself as a human at that point in time and allowed himself to die. And being human at that point in time, he could not have survived this particular series of traumas. It's not possible. Christ as God could have survived anything they threw at him. But he chose to be Christ, the human, at that point in time to die for our sins. And that given that self-limitation of remaining to be human, he died. He did not survive the event. I'm profoundly impacted by it, because I realized that the price that he paid was something I would never be willing to do for probably anybody. It's very difficult for me to even sing songs about the cross, even in worship, because I truly do understand what he paid, the price that he paid.
On April 7th, 30 AD, the world turned dark. Jesus is dead. Friday is over. But Sunday is coming.